Hotep, welcome to Matters of Diversity with Dr. B. Today is a very special day because we want to talk a little bit about what's been happening in the world today, especially with regards to the things that have happened since the Derek Chauvin trial and just the unrest that has been going on. New laws coming into play every single day with people trying to do things that just seem to be un-American. Today, I have a special guest, a former police officer, St. Francis Smith, who was born in Rochester, New York. I'll say his birth was on October 18th. I'll leave the year out. He graduated from Biloxi High School in Biloxi, Mississippi in June of 1989 and enlisted into the U.S. Army Reserves 1 month later. In October of 1990, St. Francis enlisted in the regular Army, where he endured an active military career that expanded over 2 decades. While on active duty, he served in 3 combat tours: Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and the Global War on Terrorism, with 2 tours in Afghanistan. A multitude of operational assignments to include Joint Task Force Bravo, Soto Canos, Honduras, Implementation Force, IFOR, Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm probably saying that incorrectly. Herzegovina. Multinational Force and Observers in Sinai, Egypt, to name a few. St. Francis retired honorably in October of 2010 to start a new career in law enforcement. He graduated from the Criminal Justice Academy in the Valencia College here in Orlando in March of 2011. He was appointed class president and received Covenant Dr. Stanley H. Stone Award of Excellence. He has over 10 years of local and state law enforcement experience. St. Francis education accomplishments include an associate degree in Bachelor of Science in Criminology and a criminal justice at Chaminade University in Honolulu, Hawaii. This person has been all over the place. He got that in June of 2007. And completed his master's in science, criminal justice at the University of Central Florida in 2018. He is married to Danielle Smith and has 2 sons, Xavier Smith, currently serving in the U.S. Army, stationed in Fort Polk, Louisiana, and Chandler Smith, who is a junior from Bishop Moore High School. And so with that, please, let's bring in my guest for today, St. Francis Smith. How are you, sir?
I am doing good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. And what an impressive career you have had. Not just the military experience, but the police experience that you've had, the law enforcement experience that you had. I can imagine that the things that have been happening in society, you being a Black man, the things that have been happening to Black men and you being in law enforcement must be a very interesting time. And so I want to give you space and see how you are today and what's on your mind? What do you want to talk about?
Okay. So it's interesting. One, we have 2 factors. We have being a Black male and then being a police officer. And the reason why I say that is that when I spent my time in the military, you're kind of isolated from society's environment. You have a structural platform, you have leadership guidance, and you have focus driven. So I was not aware of some of these issues going on in life because during my military career, I visited over 30 different countries just on the go. I maybe spent a total of 3 to 4 years in the country, and most of my tour was outside. So I got a wealth of international exposure and experience. Okay. So then when you retire and transition, it's funny because I chose law enforcement for the simple fact is that I hear that policing is paramilitary. And that's an interesting word to say, paramilitary.
Okay.
I'm thinking, okay, I've been in the military. I joined 17 when I was in high school. I retired at 38. So this would be perfect for me to go in, something I can be familiar with. I'm on board, but there's only one thing that makes police and paramilitary, and that they have a rank structure, in my opinion. Because I went through the academy and I was really disappointed. It was like, okay, yeah. Now I granted that Valencia is probably one of the best academies and it ran thoroughly, but then the atmosphere of um, what are we there for? Do we have values? Are we training? Are we putting ourselves to a concept of what is law enforcement instead of just learning modular, learning course objectives, and then moving on to range qualifications, driving, and high risk liabilities, and then you're certified. And so that's where it just gets a little interesting. And now you transition and go into your law enforcement agency. So you get about 3 to 4 months of field training to make sure that you're in compliance with the agency's policies. And then you become this full-fledged police officer that has the ability to go out and start doing patrols, investigations, and responding to emergency calls and do your service as what is intended for being a police officer. Then you start to understand the realities of being a police officer. And I've always mentioned one, I always thought that the racism was something that we look at and say, okay, are you going to automatically say that a police officer is racist? I have to think about that because I've been considered that. Only blacks have pulled the race card on me, and that's sad. I'll go to a call or I'll go in a situation and then they'll tell me, oh, you're just doing that because I'm black. And I couldn't register that because I'm looking at my skin and I'm like, no, I'm black too. How are you doing that? So you get caught up into enduring this every day you get in the shift. Every time you go to a call, every time you go to an urban section, you get this, you get this. But then you have to think of, why are you getting this? Why are you getting so much negative feedback from your own community? And it's an interesting topic, but we don't hear that side of it. We only hear about an engagement of a white police officer engaging with a non-white citizen, and then that's where it gets mistranslated. Do you understand that? It seems like that for every one incident that's involving a white officer and a non-white citizen, it's blown up to a proportion that that's all we see. But it's not that way. You go back. I'm a black officer. I interact with blacks, Hispanics, all other colors. But why is it not a focus point when I do it? I go on and I YouTube and I search for officer involved shooting that the officer were black and the uh, the suspect or the person was a non-black, and it's hard. It's hard to research that, but and why is that? I'm sure there are that type of engagements. I've been in that. So why is it? I can't hear you, sir. You're muted.
I was muted. I'm sorry about that. Thank you for sharing that. um, so let me ask you a question based on what you just talked about, right? So if when you are involved in talking with someone or dealing with someone who is non-black, uh, does that same kind of feeling come across? Because what we hear, especially if there's been a shooting, we hear this, well, I was fearful for my life. My life takes precedent over that person's life, especially if I have this fear factor going. And so do you think that for black officers, and I know you can only speak for yourself, have that same fear because of someone's, you know, coming for them, and that, what I mean? I don't know how I can put those into words, because I don't want it to sound like, I mean, so maybe you have a black person who's coming at you in that situation. Are you fearful of that black person, like this white officer says they're fearful of that black person? Or are you fearful of white individuals who come for you, like these white officers saying that they're fearful of a black person who is coming towards them? Do you sense what I'm talking about there?
I understand what you're saying. Um, for me, because I have military experience, I don't see it that way.
Okay.
The training that I receive, we engage and we perform in accordance with the standards of what the Army provided for us. That is missing in policing.
Okay.
Okay. So I explain to people is that one, while I was in the military, I can train a 17 or 18-year-old private not to engage an unarmed enemy, and especially not to shoot him in the back, especially even after there was a combat engagement,
Okay.
because that person is trained. Okay. Now you reverse that with the police force, you receive defensive tactics during your academy, but after that, there's no continuation training. And some police officers may not engage in a hand-to-hand combat or get into a situation where they use it for years. And
For
so
years.
they have to be able to respond based on that situation at that time. That's
So
why I
they're ill
never,
prepared. So what you're saying is they're ill prepared, even though they went through the training.
right, right, they are. And but that can be resolved. That can be resolved with a a program that will help them and um, continue to build a muscle memory. So when that situation occurs, they'll be able to better prepare themselves. And I say it like I love MMA wrestling. All right. And when you see these combatants there and they are being put in some stressful situations, but you notice they remain calm and they're sitting there, they're trying to figure out a way how to navigate themselves out of these situations. But they're in the gym 5, 6 times or 5 to 6 hours a day, preparing their mind to get into that situation. Now, we
Okay.
can't afford to do that as law enforcement officers, but we can start with mandating physical fitness, training, conditioning our minds and bodies, because our body goes through a psychological effect when we are in fear of our lives.
Hmm.
And the training that police officers get, it's not like the training that military gets. And I'll give you an example. When I was a flight medic, we had to go through a course called Dunker Heeds training, where we are able to get ourselves out of our cockpit if we go into a water crash landing.
Okay.
So up to that point, we had to do a series of training exercises, and one, you almost felt like you were drowning. You had this Navy SEAL guy looking at you and doing these exercises, and they're just looking at you like, oh, come on, drown, drown. And you're like, help me, help me, help me. But they put you in that mindset to where you could drown or get to that point to where you can feel what it is. And you're going to either panic or you're going to calm down and negotiate a plan to get you out of that situation.
Ah.
With police training, we know at the end of the day, we're going to go home. We know that uh, even if we use some pellet guns or whatever, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't do any of these things. So the mindset of preparing an officer to engage in that life threatening situation is just not there. So we have to figure out a way to get the officers more trained to do these types and engage those types. And I get where people saying, oh, the training that cost and whatever, but it costs more when those lawsuits are coming down, when that officer, and you're putting a lot of stress and burden on that officer, and he's not trained.
Hmm.
Someone can tell me that a 30-hour course in the academy is supposed to make you into this super street fighter that's, and I look at it and I say the movies, because the movies make us, superheroes, and it's just not that way. We're just not conditioned to train that way.
I hear you. Oh, wow, that's deep in some regards to that. So it's conditioning, and so when we have this fight or flight, or the fight or flight type syndrome, right? And so when we are in these caught up in these situations, we're like, well, I only had a second to think about what I need to do. The training, the muscle memory that you're speaking of will help you not make an egregious error
Yeah.
when it comes to that.
Yeah. And just physical fitness in itself. If your body goes into that hyper state of stress, well, unless you're taking some type of deprihydramine or something to physically control your breathing, exercise is one of the key important things, and it's lost in translation after you leave the academy. Now, some organizations, they have some type of PT or physical training type exercise, but not a lot of them have it. And then I asked that question, and it's like, oh well, the union is getting involved, or their human resources says that this is, but that is an important element to make sure that that officer maintains focus, mentally fit and healthy, and be able to maybe back up and use a few seconds, or buy that person a few more seconds to just make the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
Because we go home, we have this this, I guess it's a stigmata to say, well, you just got to go home to your families. You got to go home to your families. And maybe if we can add, go home to your families, but do it honorably, making sure that you've done everything that you could based on your training and experience, then I think that we can be on the right path of these officer involved shootings, and it will lower it down some.
So how do how do police officers train to de-escalate situations, right? Because I'll be honest, when you hear about people saying defund the police,
Mm.
what they're saying when they say that is, if you're listening, what they're saying is take out different responsibilities that police officers have that are not in their wheelhouse. So you encounter a person who has some mental illness issues that maybe police officers can be on hand, but what you need is a professional who deals with mental illness
Hmm.
to be able to be called to those situations,
Hmm.
right? So put money in those types of spaces and allow police officers to be police officers, to allow officers to be able to enter into the communities and be seen as a part of the community. But what ends up happening is what, in my mind, seems they're not necessarily trained to de-escalate someone who has a mental illness or somebody who is dealing with a domestic abuse situation or things along those lines. And so how do you get people to recognize that the police officers should come in and do what police officers are trained to do? They should not come in and try to de-escalate situations that are not in their wheelhouse, something that they did not train to do. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. So the word itself, defunding, I think they need to change the wording to maybe uh, whatever, but defunding can be misunderstood. And then when you have someone of a political agenda can use that defunding to present itself as a negative
Right,
word. And
right.
that's where I think that word was, someone or PR rep or something should not have used that word. So, hey,
Misappropriated the word.
yes, it should, yeah. And so with that said, is that we have to have that in place. We got to realize that a police officer receives less than 6 months of a VOTEC type training. That's it. They don't receive the training needed to address mental issues or social issues or whatever. We go out there, we're supposed to be the first line of defense in to determining whether there's crimes and then introducing that subject into the criminal justice system, period.
Right.
But throughout the time, they just pile on so much more responsibilities for the law enforcement officer to try to manage, and it's just too much for them. And I'll give you an example. I'll go to a call because the little Timmy doesn't want to go to church. Okay, why am I being called for that? That is not law enforcement.
Right.
And they just use us as, okay, a way to um,
Discipline.
do quick fixes. Okay.
Yeah.
And with the mental health, like we have the Power to Baker Act. And I think that that is such a dangerous avenue for police officers to make that decision, because we just don't know what that person is. And we have certain elements that we have to go by in order for us to give the authority to detain someone and bring them to a mental facility for treatment. But sometimes if we go to a call and we look at that person and they don't make them, they don't meet the elements for us to Baker Act them, and then we leave, and then a few days later or something like that, they may hurt themselves or hurt others. That's not fair to us, because then we look at it as, a we covered our butts. He didn't meet these elements. But why are we there in the first place when someone who's experienced could identify certain things, could ask questions that we don't know anything about, to maybe dive deeper into that person's emotions or whatever to do to help this person out? And only thing we can do is say, oh, they didn't fear for their lives at the time, or they weren't in threat of others, so we can leave this situation. And then on the flip side of that, we have certain cases to where we do Baker Act, and the parents of mentally health kids, they use that as, say, a break. Like on a Friday, we'll get a call to uh, go to a scene, and now this child meets the criteria, and so we Baker Act them just to give the parents a weekend break from that. And you identify those things and says, okay, this child doesn't need to be in a 72-hour mental health evaluation. The child needs some type of evaluation, but yet you're using police to detain this child
Yeah.
and to remove him for all the wrong reasons. But
Right.
we should not be in that position to make these calls.
We talked the other night, and you shared something that I thought was really interesting. And I wonder if you can kind of recount it a little bit. You said you'll be a police officer. Maybe you stop in a convenience store, or you stop
Oh, yeah.
in a store where you are going to maybe pick up something to drink or something,
Mhm.
and a kid is acting out. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. All the time, all the time. I'll go in, mind my own business, and next thing you know, you hear a parent says, hey, if you do not be quiet, I'm going to have that police officer arrest you. And when I hear that, I immediately address the parent and says, hey, why are you doing that? We don't arrest for misbehavior. We don't arrest because you think that you're trying to use us as a control. uh, I don't know what it's called, but you're trying to use us to control your child.
The scared
And
straight mentality.
I wouldn't even say that. I know that if you continue to do that, then all you're doing is making that child scared of the police. And what happens if they need to call the police? So they'll, in their mind, was I good with my parents as they are they going to come arrest me for this and stuff like that? So we definitely have to take that out of the equation for parents to say, hey, look, we have to figure out a way to where we understand that the police has to do a job, and that's law enforcement.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, it struck me as interesting because you have this child who now is looking at you in that manner,
Hmm.
fearful, and then
Yes.
that doesn't help cultivate a relationship
No.
with police officers. It doesn't build a community where police officers can kind of hang out. You know, the really funny thing is when I grew up, there was a police officer who lived next door to me. He worked in a different town, of course, but he lived next door to me, and it was a black male. And growing up, never was I fearful that I would never see him come back home. Times have changed. I mean, he was a part of the community, right? Even if uniform or not uniform, people knew who he was. If he came home with the car one night, people knew who he was, and and they're part of the community. It seems like that's not the case anymore. It seems like it's a us against them type of a situation, where they used to have community officers that used to be like walk the beat and just kind of hang out. What, in your estimation, what happened to that? And maybe it is in certain places, but it's not definitely something that I see in more urban settings.
I believe that the community involvement is not just for police officers to participate in community events. I think we need to go in and really understand what's going on with the issues. We never go in and do surveys, never go in and do research and development on certain areas. I would think that one of our problems would be to use some of these areas and put that gated community concept with an HOA in present. And that way it helps communities, police at the communities, understand rules and regulations, and then by those rules, kind of policing up the communities to help, instead of every few seconds. Well, if your neighbor's music is too loud, you're calling the cops for that. If you cannot agree with your neighbor, you're calling the cops for that, and that builds resentment, because now you're having police in the personal affairs, and no one wants an outsider in their personal affairs. So we kind of disassociate ourselves from just the simple, hey, if you don't like something, I should be grown up enough to come to you and say, hey, look, I don't like this. Can we sit down and resolve this? But it's quick to pick up the phone and call the police to try to resolve this. And that's where we have to figure out how we can remove that from the equation and
Right.
start working together as a community. And then communities with communities. You have certain sectors of cities that are not communicating with other sectors of the
Yes.
cities. So can we build some type of understanding to where we can have communities understand communities, instead of, hey, you stay on your side, I'm going to stay on my side, and if something happens, we're going to call the police.
Yeah. So there's this concept of, so I get what you're saying, like with the music being too loud, and you might call a neighborhood police officer to come in and do something. If you get into it with someone, it might escalate to, violence of some sort. But then you have people who call the police just because whatever, right? What they're calling them now are the Karens, right?
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't know if they're the Karens and the Kens of the world, right? So you got somebody who may be seeing somebody who may not be a regular in your neighborhood, or even if they are a regular, because sometimes they're regulars in the neighborhood, they just don't know them, right? And they call the police officers to come in on these individuals, and they escalate. And again, I'm going back to, how do we de-escalate these situations? And how do we, maybe when these people are making these false calls, do something that showcases that when you do this, we're going to take action. And so while you think we're coming here to settle this situation and it's mindless or it's whatever, you may get arrested for wasting a police officer's time, because they may be called away from something that is much more important for them to be doing, because someone is having a moment.
Absolutely. Okay, so I have to tell you a story of mine. So I got
Okay.
called on a suspicious person's call. I get there, there's a black male who had on a blue uniform, and in the back of his uniform, it had meter reader in there.
Oh,
The person had a big white device that he was using to, I guess, unhook the little tops of
the
the
meter.
whatever he was.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and you could see this from a block. So I go back and I talk to the complainant and I ask, why did you call the cops? And their response was shocking. They says, well, we didn't think blacks were supposed to be in this area. And this was back in 2012.
Okay.
And my response was, okay, educate to say, wow, I had to step back and says, all right, we got to make sure that we're utilizing the cops in the right way. You can't, and the person had identification markers on him. There was no reason why you should call. So we have to go back and we got to stop responding to these calls. Or if a person is walking down the street, then that person is walking down the street. There is no crime to that. But
Yeah.
yet we are engaging and trying to stir up something.
Yeah.
So it's us feeding into this.
Right.
These people
But
call because they're serviced, and
it's harmful though. I mean, I think about Tamir Rice, who was playing around with a BB gun, toy gun, whatever gun it was. You put into the mindset of a police officer that they're going to go into this hostile situation, and so already adrenaline is pumping
Mhm.
because you think that you're going to be entering into this hostile situation, and really, if you had just gone and just communicated, or if people had not called in the first place, people would be alive today, right?
That is a little different because of the weapon.
Yeah,
Okay. I wouldn't, I don't know. If there's a weapon involved, you have to proceed with caution. And so, not playing Monday morning quarterback or whatever, will that officer have the justification if someone has a weapon? Yes, because you have to look at it in that present time. What did that officer do? And I think with that case, they didn't have body cam footage, so we wouldn't know the
I actually think
exact
there might
person.
have been. I think what happened is the officer jumped out of the car. It might have not have been body cam. It might have been on
Okay.
on the car itself. Um, the officer seemed to have just jumped out of the car and shot the kid. I don't know all the ins and
Right,
outs of it. It's
right,
just the
right,
video footage that I saw that I'm speaking
right.
from. What I'm speaking to is not so much that they shouldn't get called. I'm asking about how it gets, how the energy amp up so much that it ends up with that type of a outcome. You know, so
Right.
and I'm not saying that if you see somebody with a gun, you shouldn't call the police. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Mhm.
But what I'm saying is that, and when it turns all out, when you look at it hindsight, it wasn't necessarily a gun that was
Right.
worth him losing his life over, so to speak, right?
Correct. And once again, I wasn't there, but it was a weapon. And for that, that officer had to make a decision based on what the information he got through the dispatch on the call, and then make an assessment right then. If you have a weapon, uh, you could, give verbal commands to try to have the person, you know, lay the weapon down to neutralize the threat. When we go to a scene in a hostile environment, we're trained to neutralize the threat. And at that time, if it's the body posture or whatever, if he wasn't uh, responding to commands or whatever, that is still a threat. And then that officer has the legal authority to neutralize that threat.
Right, right. And I understand that because I know that there are people who make bad decisions. I
Right.
get that. But I wonder though, when again, I go back to the word de-escalation. How do we get to a point where we can de-escalate the situation before there is harm, right? And so we move it to like the George Floyd case, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does that get de-escalated so that it doesn't end in the death of a person, right? Those are the types of things I'm wondering how the community can even communicate with police officers in the moment to do that. I hear these situations where someone says, we just wanted somebody to come and help calm the situation, and now this person has lost their life. And I get it. You're saying, maybe they don't have the training to go into a mental illness type situation
Right.
to deal with that. But it's happening so often now that there's got to be something that changes the tide, right? That helps the situation be better than that. So that gets so again, it goes back to my question: how do we learn or help police officers de-escalate better than what we have seen right now?
Education, training, making sure that we implement research and development in our professional standards.
So it goes back to that muscle memory you said too.
Muscle memory. Okay. With George, it's a little different because he was apprehended and he was no threat. So with his situation is a little different than someone approaching with a weapon or something that could be perceived as a threat to the officer or to the community.
Okay.
Okay. Um, we just have to understand and learn and push this information down and make sure that our officers know this. We're making the same mistakes over and over again because there's no system in place to say, okay, if it's a lesson learned, and I'll give you an example, a military, you're driving in a hostile environment, and one of the things that the Afghanis were good at, the Taliban's were good at, was these improvised explosive devices. They could make it into anything. And when you go on your convoys and one of these, your vehicles get destroyed by one of these things, well, then there's an intel report that is sent up immediately, and every unit in that theater understands what's going on and make adjustments so they can help better preserve the equipment, the personnel, and understand the fight. So we don't have that in place with what we have. If we had that, it says, okay, this is a lesson learned from us. We got to make sure that, one, we put together a plan of action and execute that plan and train accordance with to help prevent these same mistakes. And it's over and over again. And it happens in California, it's going to happen in New York, it's going to happen in Florida, but it's just like it's a rinse and repeat cycle. And so something is wrong there to where, one, why are we making the same mistakes over and over again?
Yeah.
One, it's we don't understand, or we don't understand the constitutional authority that is given to us. You know, it is the stop and frisk and the walks, and I tell people, I says, look, if a police officer walks up to you and says, let me see your ID, what do? 9 times out of 10, people are going to give them their ID, but they don't have to, you know? And at that time, if you don't have a reason to stop a person to ask for an ID, then you're violating that person's constitutional rights. Okay. But we get to a point to where, one, we either A, we're going to be submissive, or B, we're going to be what we call emotionally overcharged. We're going to be upset. And then we have protection statutes for the officers, or resisting without or resisting with violence, or do these things, but then you go back to the initial engagement, should that have even occurred? And then we go from there, but that's just lack of knowledge. And then you get into that habit of doing things of, one, you have the police officer that's just go on, and I call them the self-made police officers that will come in and throw some legal stuff at civilians, and they will bite off on it and they'll be submissive. But then it's that one time that a person is not going to be submissive, and they're going to question the officer and put the officer in check. Now that A-type mentality is going to come out. Well, I got to win this altercation, and I got to do that. And then that's where we start to see things go wrong. And then when it happens, now we got the media to deal with, we got the agency has to deal with it. And one of the key things that I look at is that when these officer involved shootings occur, they always try to find the history of the subject who got shot. If through like drug uses, they have, domestic violent histories and stuff like that.
They become the problem of their own death.
But that should not be a factor in that engagement right then, right there. We should focus on that. And then we start to sympathize, and then we let that go. And now you just have developed a police officer that can get away with that. And then they continue on. And then when you go back, and when it gets to a point, you go back through their history and you see they've had a history of bad practices, history of use of force, just aggressive posture that they should not have had. But it gotten up to that point because there's no checks and balances in place to where we could stop that. If in the military, you're one and done if you do something egregious like that. Here, you can have a file, and then if you're lucky, you can go to another agency and start another one. So we just really have to come in and identify who is a good fit to be a police officer, who can be level-headed enough to do their job. And if you admit that you're wrong, don't sit there and try to make things right. Just walk away. I've done it a lot. I'll go on a traffic stop, and if they dispel my aggression, or not aggression, but if they dispel my intentions of what they tried to commit the infraction at the time, I'll apologize and walk away. I don't need to continue the conversation. And I think you get more of it to where we have a book about this thick that has state statutes, traffic enforcement. We're not going to learn or memorize all those things. So we're going to make mistakes. But if we make the mistakes, can we have the intestinal fortitude to step back and say, I made a mistake, and learn from that mistake?
And learn from that mistake.
Right. A simple fact, twice a year, we used to do traffic enforcement, the click it or ticket. Twice a year. All right. So one morning I saw this person delivering newspapers. He didn't have his seatbelt on. So I get behind him, pull him over, and says, hey, you didn't have your seatbelt on. It's click it or ticket week. It's mandatory that we enforce this. And he tells me, he says, look, I don't have to wear my seatbelt. I'm delivering newspapers. And that was, I didn't know. I was like, oh, really? And I took the time. I went back to my car. I got on my computer and I looked it up. And sure enough, that was one of the exemptions of not having your seatbelt on. So I sent out an email to everyone. It says, hey, look, according to the statute, people who are in a mail carrier or something like that position don't have to wear their seatbelt. So be careful, because in our mind, I honestly didn't know. And in that person's mind, every time there's a shift change, when a police officer don't know, he's going to feel like he's being harassed. You see what I'm saying? So now I'm communicating with the other officers to say, hey, look, you may need to recheck this statute and stop doing this. So then my sergeant at the time comes and says, hey, why don't you worry about your own squad? Why don't you work? And I was like, wow, I'm just trying to do something to help us as a whole to get on the same page, because if we're not, then they're going to continuously stop someone who's in a mail carrier position. And then that person's going to feel like he's harassed, but yet we don't do better for ourselves as police officers to make sure we know the statutes.
Yeah. So that's interesting because what you're saying is that it's systemic within the whole police department or the whole organization as it comes to us. So, in your estimation, you know, is an 18 or 19-year-old mature enough to be a police officer? What I mean, so is there a certain
Absolutely
maturity
not.
levels that people should have to be a police officer?
Yes, and one of the biggest concerns I have is addressing domestic violence. You have a 21, 22-year-old kid going to a domestic call where the the couple is in their late 40s, early 50s, that have kids who are older than the police officer to come in. So now, what type of de-escalation skills do you have? What type of advice do you give these couples who probably had this history for a long time? We are outside our uh, scope of practice to even give any advice. So now the couple is not listening to this police officer. Now the police officer has to control the situation, and then it
Certainly.
gets bad. But he goes into that bad situation in a bad posture. He's too young to go into that situation. And so, what do we do? Do we control and secure the scene and then bring in that social worker or that experienced person to come in and try to uh, understand the situation and give better um, guidance versus this young police officer that's trying to do what he does with limited life experience and don't understand and have to maybe arrest based on encouraging or making the situation worse.
Hmm. I don't envy the position, and we don't have a whole lot of time left. What are some of your suggestions for improving police relations, police community relations, police officers, police departments? What would you share that maybe we need to kind of rethink or reimagine?
So, two critical points to building a strong police department. One, everyone has to follow the rules. No one can be exempt from a agency that is sworn to protect the Constitution, state statutes, county or city ordinances, bar none. If you're going to enforce, you can't be exempt from them. And then two, which is as important, is to remove the ability for the police to conduct their own internal affairs by uh, promoting or creating a police community for officers' affairs or whatever, and then use the inspector concept because even the police needs to be policed. There's no checks and balance. If you have issues that's in your department and you can control those issues, then they're never going to get solved. But if you have someone looking at and watching them, it's just like everything else. We're not we're not trained. We don't have the we don't have the courses. We don't have the education to do that. So give it to someone that will, and let us focus on law enforcement. Start removing these responsibilities from us. If there's calls that needs to be um, dealt with in a social worker status, a mental status, let them do it. Let us be the security of that. Okay. And then really go into these communities and understand how we can give the communities the opportunities to one, they have to learn the law. They have to understand their rights as a citizen and understand what we can do to help them to um, better support. We are your support factors. We're not going in and trying to dictate what you do. And so when you call us, make sure that you understand that once you get a police officer involved into your affairs, we're going to get involved in your affairs, and we're going to make a decision based on what we know.
Right.
Keep that in mind. 8 years, about 8 years to be a prosecutor or a defense attorney, less than 6 months to hold a badge and gun. That is a huge discrepancy. And if we can implement more training and education, we can get there. But we need to focus on restructuring and making sure that the officers do their job, which is law enforcement. And once we get that, we can move forward.
I like what you're sharing with regards to that, and I keep getting drawn back to something you said, and I'll try to continue to make sure I speak to this when I'm having these kind of conversations with folks. Muscle memory.
Mm-hmm. You
I
have
mean,
to have muscle memory.
the training. I mean, we think that once a person has gone through the training, and I'm not saying that they don't do workshops and get training. I know that they do those types of things, but as you said, I tell my daughter to practice her piano so she can get better.
Mm-hmm.
She gets frustrated when she can't get the right notes. But I say practice, continue to practice. And if you practice and you continue to practice, then you will become the pianist that you hope to be.
Yes.
I think in all our professions, that's the key, right? We continue to practice so that we can be better at what we do.
Absolutely.
And if we are just basically, like you said, getting it done in 6 months and then on the streets, that doesn't help because you're not practicing and you're not doing the muscle memory that is necessary to be perfect at your position.
Absolutely.
And of course, you might make a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. Nobody's discounting that. I don't think that people in the Black community would be upset about a mistake if indeed it was a mistake.
Right.
What happens, though, the message that we get is, oh, I was scared, or I was fearful, or I was this, or I was that. And that doesn't sit well, right? Because it's like, well, why were you scared? Why were you fearful? And then I hear you say muscle memory.
We have to prepare for the worst, and we're not doing it. And we get so comfortable of going in and thinking that the experience is going to train us. And that's bad. We have to go in ready for that experience, ready for that challenge. Every time we go, what we call 10-8, every time we go on duty, and I refer back to my military, it's like when we go to combat, every time we leave the compound, we may not come home. So our senses are sharpened, our focus is there, because we want to just come home the next night. We know we're going to be in this deployment for a year or so. Think about the officer who goes out in their just daily 12-hour, 8-hour shift, not having some type of prepared mentality. And then that incident happens within that split second. What do? You're going to fight for your life. You're going to do things that will help you survive that instance at that time. That's a lot of responsibility that we're putting on the police officer, that we're not preparing them and not training them to engage. And you know what? You may put in a lot of training and get this person prepared, and he may or she may never engage in that, but you know that that person can handle it, and not the opposite, to where we have so many of these people that are just using their natural instincts of survival to try to handle a deadly situation.
I like that. I when you were saying that just now, I got drawn to the dunk thing that you were sharing.
Yes.
And getting to a point where you calm yourself down and you handle the situation.
Yes, you have to. You have to put yourself in that situation. And then when you're in that situation, then only you can start to think, okay, the first thing I need to do is calm down, because that chamber, it puts you in a whirlwind, because you don't want to drown. You keep sucking up water, or you're trying to get air, and your body is processing that. Well, if you don't calm down, you're going to keep sucking in water, or you need to calm down and start looking for an exit to get out of there so you can. So these are some of the things, but you're not going to understand that until you're put into that situation.
Wow. That's powerful stuff right there. So as an aside, and you don't have to answer this question, but what are you doing, or how are we getting this message out to police officers to help make this change?
Well, we have to start with reform. But the only way we can start for reform if we understand who has the power to make the changes. And the person of interest is the attorney generals, the state and the federal attorney generals. And I'm kind of confused as to when something happens in the military, the Secretary of Defense can mandate changes. He goes in, he says, you will do this, and all the branches of service will do it based on what we have. We haven't had that yet. We have protesting, we have all these thoughts and ideas, but no one is addressing it to the right people that can change this.
Yeah.
We can go
well,
down
now
there.
we got the new law is here in Florida anyway, where protesting could be illegal.
Right. And so talk to the people that has the changes. And that's where I'm concerned about that. We can make these changes, but is the police willing to give up their power over internal affairs? Are they going to be comfortable with someone looking at them, watching them, making sure that they're okay? There's a lot of issues in resolving this that we have to come down and says, okay, we've been doing it for this long, for this many years, and nothing is working. How about trying it?
Yeah.
And protection of the police officers. If there is something right, and I'm going to be careful when I say this, people says, okay, there's good and bad police officers. I have to kind of disagree with that. They're good-hearted police officers. Police officers want to do the right thing, but can they do the right thing? And the only reason why I say that is because I was a victim of that. I reported some issues at my former police department, and I got crucified for it, and it bothers me because in hindsight, when we go in and we do investigations, we tell the person that we got, hey, you need to give us this information, but yet we can't do it on our own and within our house. So we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing and make sure that we're protected to do the right thing. And then we can have good officers. And people say, oh, you were a good officer. You were this. I says, no, I was a good officer. Now I'm a survivalist like everyone else. We got to survive our situation. If it gets too bad where it falls on me, then I may have to address it. But most times we will just avoid it. And I give people this example. Here's the example of what happened. Say if the Derek would have held George to the ground with his knees, and one of those officers would have pushed him to the side and says, hey man, you can't do that. And then okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so they would have brought George back to the police department and processed him and stuff like that. And then that officer who pushed Derek off of George reported Derek, that officer would have got fired. I guarantee you he would have got fired. But because we have the technology now and people are watching, now we have to own up to our actions.
What do they call that? The blue code or the blue
the
whatever?
Wall of silence, the blue wall of silence.
The blue wall of silence. That's my fear. I don't ever do anything where I feel like I will be in an altercation with the police officers. But because of what I've seen and because of this blue wall of silence and other things, I then have trepidation about police officers. And, should I have that? I mean, especially in my life, growing up with uncles who were police officers and neighbor who was a police officer, I don't want to have bad feelings about police officers. I've known great police officers in my lifetime. But when you see people stand behind this code, I mean, you see it all over the place, right? We see people doing bad things, but it's in, people get a pass. Like, I think about congressmen who are making these decisions about gerrymandering this law and that law. We see it.
Mm-hmm.
People must see it, but they get this pass.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we got to be better. We got to do better than that.
Yeah. And I tell my family and friends all the time, get through the encounter with the police officer. Do not question them on scene. You know, we can get through it. We may have to use legal actions or whatever, but you have to get through
Yeah.
that contact. When you get
You know,
into
I was thinking about that because, you know, and I know we have to get off of this really soon, but my thought is this. People from the Black community are expressive. Sometimes they would call emotional, and that's not everybody. I'm not trying to stereotype there, but it seems as though our ability to be expressive gets us in trouble with police. Our ability to kind of be boisterous or loud, to speak up for ourselves, that resistance and that not resistance, that ability for us to kind of be resilient
Mhm.
sometimes gets used against us, and we lose out because somebody else has that position of power and will use what we have done or how we respond or how we kind of present ourselves against us. Like, I'm 6'4". I feel like that could be used against me. I have no control over being 6'4".
Right.
I have no control over being Black, but
Right.
it could be used against me if I raise my voice and seen as an angry Black man.
Yes.
All of a sudden, I'm the threat.
Yes. 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 And so we have to do our part and just get out of that situation. Then come back and see what we can do to understand why that police officer pulled you over at that time. But if you go and you engage at that time, the police officer has the authority. They have
Or they
lethal
feel they have the
weapons.
authority.
Well, yes, that's correct. And then they have tools right then, deadly tools that could make it to where you don't make it out of that. So
Yeah.
these are some of the things that we have to consider
So
when we're engaged.
So again, you said authority, and I'm wondering because when I think about that, I think I talk about this often. That puts somebody in this position of power over this person. Is there ever a situation where police officers and civilians are equal? Should it always be equal?
Yes, and they will be equal as long as they don't violate the Constitution. And that's where there is a huge disconnect with policing and civilians. I can walk up to you and I'm in uniform and we are of the same. It's when your actions go against the Constitution, something that I am sworn to protect and defend, to where now I have the authority to do something to either uh, apprehend you, take your freedom, bring you into some place. But other than that, everyone is on equal. But then we get to that point to where it just by me walking up to you in the capacity of a police officer, are you going to be submissive and give me that authority? Or are we going to sit back as that police officer? I should know better and not engage you unless you are giving me the authority to engage you.
Yeah, great words, man. Any last minute thoughts? We're a little over time, but I really appreciated getting the opportunity to talk with you. I think the message resonates really strongly in terms of what we have to do. We can't be afraid to change things that don't work. We have to we have to be about doing it in a way where we can become much better attuned to each other than we are right now because there's just too much disconnect.
Right. Two thoughts. One, we do have the power to make changes. Okay. And one, we have to hold everybody accountable for their actions. We have to
regardless of who.
start implementing leadership, integrity,
Yeah,
transparency, and teamwork, not just the teamwork within the agency, but the teamwork within the communities too. It
yeah.
can't be us and
Love
them.
that.
It can't be. And so
I
if we
love
can
that.
figure that
Yeah,
out, then we can change this. I've been in an organization for over 20 years that is not perfect, but highly effective. And so instead of that paramilitary, that they need to start going in and making it more look paramilitary, not just and I'm going to be careful when I say this, because when people look at military, they look at the drill sergeant hat and people yelling and stuff like that. It's nothing like that. It's about building a core values of what you believe in, how you're going to put on your uniform every day and do your job to the fullest and have the courage to stand up for what's right.
yeah,
And right now, we don't have that. If we try to stand up, we will get crucified
yeah,
within our ranks.
yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
I,
you.
I love your narrative, and I appreciate that you would be willing to come on and share that. I know that, a lot of times, and I talk with police officers who don't have that same feeling. There's this, again, like the blue wall or whatever. But I think you stated it very clearly. There's things that we can do to reform,
Yes, we
and I
can.
appreciate that. And I think that we can always have a conversation about that, because nobody always gets it right.
No,
There are things that we can do to kind of help make that change and be better about it.
absolutely.
So thank you for being my guest today. I really truly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Um,
appreciate being here.
we'll have to continue to talk, and you've given me a lot to think about in terms of what my advocacy can look like when I talk with police officers, and let them know I'm not against you. I don't think that is where I'm coming from, but I surely don't want to be in a situation where my life is put in danger because someone doesn't see me for my humanism
Right.
and what I represent. And that seems to be the narrative that's out there.
Yes.
And that's what I want to change. Well,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for
You
having me.
enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you all for listening in today, and join us next Wednesday on Matters of Diversity. Appreciate it.